Good morning, and welcome to our study of the Book of Esther, Part 7. This part of the story is rather straightforward as far as the story itself goes. So we'll just read through the chapter basically and go over the elements of the story and then get into the background, the parts of the book behind the story that are important. If you recall from the last time, Haman was now going to the second banquet organized by Queen Esther along with King Ahasuerus. When he left the first banquet, Haman was rather proud and puffed up at the fact that he had been invited now to a second banquet. He felt very good about himself. He felt very good about being honored, that he would be probably one of the prime people at this gathering. But since that time, King Ahasuerus had this dream and had honored Haman's arch-enemy Mordecai, and at the same time had humiliated Haman. So going to this second banquet was not probably the thing that Haman really wanted to do. He probably felt rather rejected and somewhat anxious as he went to this banquet. As it said here, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." Now, King Ahasuerus reiterated his desire to honor Queen Esther's petitions and her requests as he had done at the first banquet and when they had first met. This was in the second day of the banquet of wine. After having a considerable meal or a feast, this banquet would often go on for a day or two. And at this banquet of wine, it would be primarily desserts and more wine for some considerable period of time. We don't know the time at which this took place, but it probably was around noontime or early afternoon because of what happened subsequently. But anyway, at this banquet of wine, the king again made his request, his plea to Esther, to what is your request and what is your petition? And Queen Esther then answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been told, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So Queen Esther actually made her petition for her own life and her request for the life of her people. And she did this by reiterating the exact words that were in Haman's petition to the king to have the Jews destroyed, be annihilated, to be destroyed, and to be killed. So this was her petition for her own life and her request for the life of her people. And the king said to the Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" Now the question is, did the king not remember that he himself had signed the declaration? Or was he unaware that the declaration that he had signed was against the Jewish people? Because he was the king of 127 different provinces with many different nationalities and slaves under his domain. And when Haman asked for this petition for a people to be removed from the kingdom, he didn't say which people it was. So maybe the king was not aware that it was going to be the Jewish people. And up to this time, there's no indication that he knew that Esther was herself a Jewess. So he may have been quite surprised by this plea and this request on Esther's part. So he said, "Who is this? Where is he? Where's the person who would dare do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Now if Haman was anxious beforehand, he now became terrified because he knew the situation he was in. The king was angry. The queen was pleading for her life. The king now knew that his wife was one of the Jewish people, that Haman was trying to eliminate, and he was very upset. So upset that he arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden to collect his thoughts. He didn't take any of his eunuchs, any of his helpers with him. He went by himself into the garden just to think what he would do. And while he was there, Haman, the proud person that he had been, now suddenly became very terrified, very frightened, very conciliatory, and went to plead for his life to Queen Esther, the person that he had vowed to kill along with all her people. Now he went to plead with her for his life. And he realized that evil was now being determined against him by the king. So when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of business of wine, he noticed that Haman had either prostrated himself, or had fallen, or had been bowing very vigorously. We don't really know exactly the position he was in. Some Jewish sources say that an angel pushed Haman onto Queen Esther, but that's a bit maybe hard to accept. Anyway, Haman was in a position that, in his pleading for his life, he was in a position that King Ahasuerus interpreted it as being not acceptable. Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was lying. Now, in these days, people didn't sit in chairs. They were sort of reclined on low couches. And Haman had fallen across, or had been this couch where Esther was lying. And the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" And immediately when this happened, the handlers covered Haman's face with a cloth. Now, these handlers obviously had been courteous, had been giving honor to Haman before. But now, whenever this comment was made, they immediately covered Haman's face with a cloth, indicating that the death sentence was going to be given. There was no more conciliatory tone. There was no questioning whether this was right or not. There was no doubt this was going to happen, and they immediately covered Haman's face with a cloth. One of the eunuchs already said, "Look, he's already built a gallows. Let's use it." And so the king agreed to hang Haman from the gallows which he had originally built for Mordecai. And so this was done. The king said, "Hang him on it." And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Thus was the king's wrath subsided. There's some sources and some ideas behind this, because no book is put in the Bible just because it's a good story. There are lessons to be learned from it, and there are things that have to be realized that happen behind the scenes. The first of all, of course, is all these so-called coincidences which led up to this point in time. Esther, an orphan, a slave, a Jewess, happened to be taken in by her uncle Mordecai, who happened to have a place in the palace. King Ahasuerus happened to have deposed his wife, Queen Vashti, and happened to have a contest to choose a new queen, which Esther entered and happened to win. She happened to win the favor of the king's eunuch. She happened to be told how to get there, how to present herself to the king. She happened to be selected. She happened to be right at that time when it was necessary for Haman to be overcome in his desire to defeat and eliminate the Jewish people. She was the only person that really could do it at that particular point in time. She just happened to be there. She just happened to delay her request from the first meeting to the second meeting to the third meeting, so that the king just happened to have a bad night sleeping and happened to read about Mordecai's protection of him previously, and they just happened to want him honored at the same time Haman wanted to have himself honored in a way in which he described to the king. Are these all circumstances? Of course not. They're all really the evidence of God acting behind the scenes and controlling this in a way which brings an outcome which he wants himself, because this was the salvation of the Jewish people, and it was from the Jewish race that Christ himself came. So there are different lessons to be learned from this. First of all, it shows that the deliverance of one may lead to the downfall of someone else. The deliverance of Mordecai led to the downfall of Haman. It also shows that pride is the main downfall of many people. It was Haman's pride that had him lead and come to King Ahasuerus with all the way in which he wanted to be honored. And it was that way which led to his humiliation. It was his pride in wanting to get rid of Mordecai before the date which he himself had chosen for the elimination of the Jewish people. It was his pride to eliminate Mordecai right away, which made him build the gallows right away. And then go to King Ahasuerus wanting to have the privilege of hanging Mordecai from those gallows early. It was pride. And pride goeth before a fall. Pride is considered to be in the Bible, of all the sins in the Bible, pride is probably the most prominent and the most devastating. So the destruction of one may come about as the deliverance of another. The second, of course, is the dedication of one may make the difference for many. Esther's dedication to go to the king, even though her life was in danger, was the one that made the difference for the entire Jewish race. And it was noted that she prepared herself by prayer and by fasting for days beforehand. It was noted that the king himself, even when he was considering what to do with Haman, went out to the garden and collected his thoughts. Haman, however, when he wanted to get rid of Mordecai and it was suggested to him to build the gallows, went right out and built them. So the dedication of one, in this case Esther, may lead to the deliverance of many. And also the fact that the delay of justice does not necessarily mean the denial of justice. And these are things which we should consider ourselves from this story, because there are many aspects of today's life which seem to be just sliding by, which seem to be that the people who are most corrupt often seem to get ahead the fastest. The people who have many of the aspects of a life which is not what we consider good seem to do better than those who do try to do good, just try to do their honest day's job for an honest day's pay. But justice denied is not justice, or justice delayed is not justice denied. There are other things of this point too that we have to go back. It says back in Exodus 17:14 that God said to the Hebrews that he will utterly destroy the Amalekites. He says, I will utterly blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Now this was not done at that time, because Saul, when he defeated the Amalekites, spared the king, King Agag, and a lot of the other aspects of that civilization. And it was from the King Agag that Haman was descended. He was an Agagite, and he was an Amalekite. So this was coming at about time when this story comes about at a time when God was about to fulfill his promise back in the book of Exodus. Because when Haman was hanged, he was an Amalekite. And from this point on in the Old Testament, Amalekites are no longer mentioned. No further are they mentioned in this book. So this was the last, theoretically, last mentioned of the Amalekites. And the thing most important to remember is that one person's dedication can make the difference for so many. Esther was one person, and she was making a difference for the entire Jewish race. This was the main theme of this particular part of the book. It was her actions, it was her doings that led to the survival of the Jewish people. And it does not just happen in the older times. Let me give you an example of what happened in more modern times, an example which I did give in church previously. There was a man back in the early 1800s by the name of Edward Kimball, who was a Sunday school teacher, and he taught a number of boys in a classroom in a small church in Boston. Boys which were unruly, some of which did not want to be there, one of whom particularly did not want to go to Sunday school, and he actually went to the shoe store where this boy worked and talked to him about Christ at his place of employment. Most people would not do that for an unruly Sunday school student, but this Mr. Kimball did, and he actually convinced this boy to accept Christ at his place of employment, at his place of work. Now the boy's name was Dwight Moody, and as we all know, he went on to become a great evangelist, founder of the Moody Institute, a number of other biblical persuasions, and he went on to become a great evangelist in his own right. And one of the people who he evangelized, who he spoke to, was a man by the name of Wilbur Chapman. Now, this would be quite a story in itself, but it doesn't end there, because Wilbur Chapman also became an evangelist and had meetings in both North America and in Europe. And at one of his meetings, a baseball player came, when there was no baseball game that day, came and listened to him and actually accepted Christ and became part of his team. And Wilbur Chapman became the pastor in a large church. This man by the name of Billy Sunday went on to develop an evangelistic outreach of his own, holding services in the United States. And one of the people he went on to mentor was a man by the name of Mordecai Ham. Mordecai Ham, in turn, had further evangelistic meetings himself, and one day in the southern part of the States, he was in a meeting in North Carolina, and a group of boys came in. These boys apparently had been going or had been associated with others who were going to a house of ill repute across from the high school they attended. And it is said that they came actually to heckle and to disrupt the meeting. One of the boys who came along with them was intrigued by what was being said and went back and forth a number of times and eventually himself accepted Christ. His name was Billy Frank, although we now know him as Billy Graham. So you see, from one Sunday school teacher evangelizing and talking to one boy led to all these other evangelists coming about and doing their part in the world of evangelism. So one person can make a difference. Just Esther made a difference to her people, and it was actually the fact that she was there and saved her people because of her actions. So Haman was hanged as a result of his pride and of his arrogance and of what he wanted to do. Mordecai has been promoted. Esther has been honored. The Jewish people have been saved. This is not the end of the story, but it's sort of the part of the climax of this whole book. And it is a story which is still told. It is a story which is still celebrated by Jewish people almost every year in the Feast of Purim, a feast which acknowledges the fact that the Jewish people were saved by the actions of Esther at this time in history. So next time we'll go on to chapter 8 and go on further in this book. We have 3 more lessons left, but we'll go on to chapter 8 next time. So thanks for watching. Bye for now. Hope to see you next week.